This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. We begin today's show with two segments from Dan O'Brien, K-State grain economist, and Guy Allen, the senior economist at the IGP Institute, as they discuss the domestic and international grain market. The pair talks about corn, wheat, and soybeans, while Guy also shares information about the U.S. dollar and shipping around the world. K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond completes the show with a weather update. He discusses the recent moisture in Kansas and the potential cooler temperatures we can expect into next week. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update as we talk about the international and domestic market with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien and the senior economist at the IGP Institute, Guy Allen. Dan, Guy, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you, Shelby.
Kicking off, we're going to talk through a few different of our commodities. And first off, looking at corn and first touching on the domestic side of things.
Of course, the corn market's such an important element for the United States, really, between corn and soybeans, and wheat also important, but suffering more right now due to world dynamics. But on the corn side, really, as we were talking before we came on air between us, really no changes in the U.S. domestic balance sheet from the February report to the March report, except a small lowering of the U.S. corn price projected for this marketing year. Again, the one that started last September 1st, going to end up here August 31st of 2024, dropped to $4.75. Interesting that we're at that mode now where we've come through about 2 or 3 months of very docile U.S. domestic markets. Not a lot of change. And so here we have a supply-demand balance sheet on the usage side. No changes at all. When you do look back over the last 3 years, say from the 2021-22 marketing year to the one we're in, the 23-24, ethanol usage was 5.32 2 years ago, 5.17 last year, 5.375 this year. So arguably, one sector that's holding up pretty well for corn usage in the U.S. is on ethanol side. Of course, that's helped by lower corn prices. And would add in on the feed residual usage was 5.67 2 years ago, dropped last year on a little bit lower production down to 5.5, back up projected 5.6, 5.7. Not a lot of change there. The export side, which is kind of the lead in on the international side, Guy, if you want to take it from there, on U.S. exports. 2 years ago, $2.472 billion, dropped last year. Again, the exports were the residual claimant after we covered the domestic bases for crush and feed use and wet corn milling, dropped to 1.6, 1.7, projected back up to 2.1. And there's a number of things happening internationally with competitors that all play into that change. Guy, what do you think?
Yep. Yeah, look, the corn export situation for the U.S. continues to be a bit disappointing. And even though we had non-U.S. corn output dropped by 2.3 million tons this past month, adjustments to our competitors' exports, Brazil really no change, but they're quite strong competing on that as their season extends. South Africa lowered their exports 500,000 tons. Ukraine shipments were raised 1.5 million tons to 24.5. So it's Argentina was up 1 to 25 million metric tons. So we're going to continue to see fairly strong competition on that side. Doesn't necessarily bode well for the U.S. Corn exports. Also, on top of that, we've seen imports from the EU down 1 million tons to 22. One bright spot in the U.S. situation is Mexico imports are up 1 million tons to 20.6. which should be approaching a record import for Mexico corn. Southeast Asia was up slightly to 18.2 million metric tons. South Korea, though, was lowered. and it's standing at 1.6 million tons. China imports estimates remain unchanged at 23 million metric tons. They should again be the biggest importer of U.S. corn this coming year, of corn in total. Overseas, one thing that's really hurting U.S. corn exports and even domestic demand is increased in wheat feeding. We'll talk about that in a bit when we get to the wheat values. Wheat values are cheap enough. They're pricing themselves quite aggressively into the feed complex. Overseas wheat feeding was up 1.6 million metric tons to 158.8 million metric tons, which is 7 million tons more than last year's number.
Add in on that, the pathway of what's been happening over in the Black Sea area, at Black Sea region, sure interesting in that, Ukraine 2 years ago had production of 42 million metric tons. That was a strong high for them. Exports of 27. Then they dropped off last year to 27 million metric tons. Still exported 27 million metric tons. But then this year projected at about 29 and a half, up in the last month from 23, 24 and a half, but still doing decent. And you've got that. Then if I can add in here, then Russia was at 15 million metric tons production 2 years ago. Last year, 15.8. This year projected 17, 16. There's been some change in production area. Some of the war-torn areas are being farmed now by Russia, so that's come into play. And Guy, any thoughts on that Black Sea region issue and where that's going to go?
No, nothing to really add from what you've put in there, Dan. While it tends, they're getting a good volume of grain and oilseeds out of Ukraine-Russia situation. I think that continues to be a bit precarious at times, particularly the Ukraine, but it just continues to surprise me how much volume they've been able to move out.
Amen to that.
While we're on the corn complex, might touch base on sorghum. Sorghum is probably one of the brighter spots in there. USDA raised U.S. exports by 5 million bushels to 245 million. China continues to be the strong buyer for that market and leaving a fairly reasonable premium in that market for U.S. sorghum. We're starting to have to compete at the moment with some southern hemisphere exports coming out of both Argentina and Australia in that sorghum market, but our basis has remained relatively firm.
Yeah, really, in terms of looking for a commodity that's been doing well export-wise that affects Kansas, grain sorghum is it. It's had a strong run, but I think it's kind of like what we learned. The lesson we learned in the soybean market, we have a strong demand when we're relying on China, but it's a narrow base, and it's the last time we had any geopolitical back and forth that came into play, trade wars, whatever. It was grain sorghum that really was affected by that. So it's strong, but there's the element of geopolitical risk with our on and off relationship with China.
Yes.
And wanting to move on to another crop now and discussing wheat. And Guy, you mentioned that there's been an increase in wheat feeding. Yeah,
that's not a surprising but significant change. And it's as it competes with corn. But I think if you look at both wheat, soft red winter and hard red winter, it's quite cheap. And I know we're putting more of that and expected to put more of that in the first and second quarter of the wheat marketing year into feedlots in Kansas, Texas, and particularly in the West. Dan, you're probably more closer to that domestically than I am.
Well, Shelby, you and I have been watching those prices, commenting on the not so much the cash bids, though they've tightened up, but the new crop bids. The last week that we looked at them in the Garden City area, and that's where the feedlots are. That's where we'd be feeding it. And it got down to about 107% ratio between basically December wheat, new crop wheat prices, new crop corn prices, and some difference in timing there. But the ratio had gotten down tight enough, close to that area of about 105, 106. Well, it's at 107, and if it's cheap enough on the wheat side, then people will feed it. There's some changes in rations that happen, all those real world pragmatic things that have to be dealt with. But yet, if it's cheap, it is what it is. And Guy, what you said, sure borne out in the last 3 years of the market, last three U.S. wheat marketing years. 2 years ago, we projected by the USDA, fed 88 million bushels, 77 million bushels in 22, 23, and that was in a dry year when we needed to feed something, a lot of that right out here in Kansas, and then projected this year at 120. So the lower wheat prices sure seem to be bringing that in.
Yeah, one surprising thing is that same week of the last week USDA report, we saw China cancel, it was a little over 200 million bushels of soft red winter wheat exports. And I've been trying to find out if they just canceled that or if they were buying cheaper wheat out of the Ukraine or some other origin. And I haven't been able to confirm that alternative purchase in there, but that weighed on the market a bit. That said, following the USDA report numbers coming out, wheat was actually firmed up a bit. So maybe we've seen some bottom in both the corn and the wheat complexes. Both those markets have at least been steady to firmer since last week's USDA report.
The only follow-up I saw to that same bit of news was that China had also canceled French wheat purchases and some others as well. So it's not just the U.S. So it makes that may not be geopolitics as much as being in some contracts. They either they don't need it anymore or they want to get out of some contracts and buy something cheaper, which they're very shrewd, capable buyers, and they certainly do that upon need. So
yeah.
I know we had to wrap up. Wheat ending stocks lowest since 2015-16. So again, we're bemoaning low wheat markets, but we tightened up even further with this report. And somewhere out there's a time of volatility coming when the Black Sea region doesn't come through with large cheap supplies, and then where will the world go?
We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll once again be joined by Dan O'Brien and Guy Allen as we continue reviewing the WASDE report that came out last week. We're cutting that short break now, but stick around because we'll be right back. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien and the senior economist at the IGP Institute, Guy Allen, as we continue talking about the WASDE report. Previously, we talked about corn and wheat. However, starting off this conversation, talking about soybeans.
In a couple weeks, there'll be a USDA prospective plantings report, and that report's expected to show that farmers are switching towards soybeans, about 1.6 million acres more than last year, putting them up to about 83.5, 84, and taking corn down by just about the same amount. And that's because the prices for soybeans relative to their costs and relative to corn, new crop bids are more attractive. And that's comparing, say, 11.87 soybeans on yesterday's close for the November contract, East corn at 4.67 3/4. Still quite early in the growing season. There's a lot of domestic factors that can affect that, but that's where we stand right now. The soybean balance sheet had no changes to it, not even in the price. It is interesting that 2 years ago, we had ending stocks, 274 million bushels, 13.30 price, about 6% stocks to use. Went down a little bit last year, 264 million bushels ending stocks, 14.20 price, stocks to use about 6%. And this year, without that much change, really up now to projected to be 315 million bushels of carry out. Stocks, instead of 6.1 or so, now it's 7.6. Prices, instead of being 13.30 or 14.20, down to 12.65. So, Guy and I, we talk supply demand numbers and scarcity of supply availability to the market. And, you see that situation. It hasn't taken that much of a change domestically to drop prices pretty well. Of course, sizable South American crops coming on certainly are important. Guy?
Yeah, look, those big crops in Brazil particularly and Argentina are just really weighing on that market and U.S. exports. Brazil's export forecasts were up 3 million metric tons to 103. Argentina was left unchanged at 4.6 this year. So we'll continue to watch that. Some people are quite skeptical on that Brazilian number, particularly given some discrepancies between USDA numbers and private trade numbers on Brazilian production, given the dry weather down there. Probably the biggest surprise that I saw in the report was The USDA raised China's imports by 3 million tons to 105. That would be a record, particularly in the wake of what we've seen as a rather soft import program thus far, most of it coming from Brazil. However, with that increase, they're also increasing their carryout by about 5 million metric tons there as well on the ending stocks to 37.6. And I'd be a bit surprised to see China raise their ending stocks by that much. Another little anomaly I've found from my colleagues in the trade is China has, the last 3 or 4 years, continually underestimated what their imports were, if you actually count the boats that we see going in there. So there's a bit of discrepancy between the official numbers and what we actually have seen if you're counting the boats going into China on the
way. And that's a demand signal. If you increase the number of boats estimated and the quantity, well, then they'd end up and have to pay more for the price. The market would see that as a signal.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, that's where I see the most uncertainty in the marketplace. Not surprising is what's China going to do on those total soybean imports, but we'll watch that. Disappointing thing is, at the moment, Brazilian soybeans are nearly $1 a bushel cheaper than the U.S. on a FOB-to-FOB basis. That's just really hard to compete with. Doesn't bode well for U.S. soybean exports for the next 5-6 months as we go through the summer on that. So it's just really hard to see any support coming on that. That said, not too much different from corn and wheat. We have seen soybeans sort of put a bottom in, been steady to firmer since that USDA report.
Guy, the unabated growth trend in Brazilian soybean production's surely affecting the market. It's affecting how much they have available to export, our competitive position with them, et cetera, that, their expanding area. And I don't wish ill on any other country, our ag producing colleagues, friends in those areas, but their growth is a big factor in the world. If you saw that level off and usage continue to go, it'd be a different story. But right now they're keeping the pace.
Yeah, you were talking about that, expecting the U.S. farmer to shift into soybeans at a fairly large number this year. I'll remain a bit of a skeptic on that, Dan. It's just hard to get the U.S. grower to grow something other than corn. He likes to grow corn. So we'll see how that moves as he moves into the field here in coming weeks. I'm sitting in Chicago at the moment. We've had some good rains here at the end of the week. Quite welcome. We needed those rains. And in the next couple of weeks, they should be burning diesel and getting those corn and beans planted quite aggressively.
We market analysts learned a hard lesson last June 30th in acreage report when the USDA thought almost this very same scenario was going to happen where, man, we're way up on beans, going to be down on corn. And they dropped beans by 4 million acres and raised corn by 2. And we're still dealing with the impact of those higher corn acres all the way through now. So anyway.
There's some interesting things happening in the oil and meal and the complex sort of things. Did you want to expand on that a bit, Dan?
Yes. Domestically, in terms of the U.S. supply-demand balance sheet, again, no changes for soybeans, but for byproducts, for soybean meal, we did see domestic disappearance of soybeans down about 400,000 tons, offset by an increase in exports of about 500,000 short tons. So really no change in price, just some shifting around. I try to follow soybean exports, and they're spotty just like all of these commodities, but we have had several weeks where U.S. soybean meal exports have jumped up above the USDA numbers or the pace needed to meet USDA's projections. And a year ago, we blamed that on, well, gosh, you've got poor production in Argentina. And that was kind of the mode of that. But again, lower prices, just export competitiveness, other issues causing this, what we're seeing going on now. And pace of late being decent. Of course, they're going to compete against Argentina, largely in the world market, others. And I guess I need to pay closer attention to what's happening in that Argentine soybean meal market, because it's that and other factors sure affecting the exports of soybean meal.
Yeah, well, it's been good to see that aggressive exports of U.S. meal in that whole protein complex. That's where the big question mark has been, and we've had a good, strong pace on the meal side of things.
And Guy, while we have you on, always wanting to touch on how the U.S. dollar is doing. And so how is the U.S. dollar doing?
Well, we were a bit stronger here on at the end of this week, back up to about 103 on the index. We've seen the weaker dollar start to help, I think, lend a bit of support to our export programs as the commodities are becoming a bit more competitive. I always get a bit worried when we see that U.S. dollar raise. It just makes already expensive commodity even more expensive for a lot of our customers on that. Yeah, I might shift a bit for the shipping, and we've seen the Baltic Dry Index rally a bit in the last 2 weeks. It's up above 2,200. Nothing overly strong, but continued disruption in the Red Sea with the Houthi disruption on ships continues to cause problems across those trade channels. Also, the Panama Canal is operating well, but we continue to need rain down there. Because we don't have a big export program, the U.S. has sort of solved that problem by anything going west is coming off the PNW. Anything out of the center going east is coming out of the center Gulf. So we've sort of addressed that problem or those issues with our domestic internal trade flows to those export markets. On the Mississippi, water is back up to normal, but will need some good summer rains to maintain that, to avoid a water problem and low water later in the year. So we continue to watch that as well. On one footnote, U.S. river system Center Gulf has put a record number of containers out of the Center Gulf. These are containers that have been shipped by barge down to the port. It's going to be interesting to see how that supply chain for that container market continues to grow in coming years.
And as we round out today's conversation then, from this WASDE report, what would you really like to tell Kansas agriculture producers?
Domestically, we're just now to mid-March, and all of our risk and uncertainty from domestic U.S. production's all in front of us. We don't have as much of, at least in Kansas, we have dry areas as farther to the east you go, but not as terribly dry as we were a year or so ago. So with dry conditions around the U.S., we'll probably get the crops planted really well. So that probably won't be as much of an issue if dry conditions continue. So we'll get the crop planted, but we'll be watching closely what people like Chip Redmond, others, other climatologists at KSU elsewhere, the news they have coming for projections they have coming forth, just to see what moisture is and will be coming into this summer. So we're in a weather market right now, not much weather.
The only thing I would add to that, Shelby, is a number of these geopolitical issues that remain in the forefront really haven't become tremendous problems. Black Sea, Ukraine specifically. Some of the shipping issues, grains and the bulk commodities have been able to address fairly efficiently. The problems haven't necessarily gone away. As we enter into these summer months, as Dan said, we're going to be looking at weather markets and production. And I continue to look at these geopolitical issues, which could raise their head anytime and really cause some issues for agriculture.
Dan, Guy, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us an update from domestic and international side of the grain market.
Thank you, Shelby.
Thank you.
That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien, and he was joined by the senior economist at the IGP Institute, Guy Allen. I will link the recent WASDE report in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with a weather update with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Chip, wanting to first start by talking about the recent moisture we had in Kansas.
Some folks got a lot of moisture, quick pace. Others got a nice, gentle rain that lasted for a long period of time, and then some folks got none. Southwest stayed dry. They're about 40 days displaced now from at least 1/10 of an inch of rainfall in a day. So they were really dried out. And as you get further east, central and northern Kansas was the beneficiary of mostly light rain at times. There was a couple thunderstorms that brought some hail with it. But overall, rainfall amounts were on the lighter side of about 1/2 inch. And then as you get further east along the Missouri border, and then along I-70 there in northeast Kansas, we saw rainfall up to 1 inch plus in places, and even some localized 2 inches. Our average rainfall this time of year is increasing. We get around 1/2 inch of rain, or a little bit less in central Kansas, more to the far east, less to the far west. The good news is that kept us up with normal for the most part with that trend. Southwest obviously drier than normal, but we need another storm a week basically to keep precipitation amounts up and to keep up without getting drought expansion, which we did have some drought expansion this week, especially in the Southwest, where we saw D0 abnormally dry conditions expand.
And something we've been feeling for a lot of March, above average temperatures.
Yeah, we just continue to be above normal, and even a cooler day, both Thursday and Friday this week, but they're still average temperature-wise. And we just have not had a good source of cold air anywhere to our west or north, and that's helped us stay warm. Temperatures still 15, even 20 degrees above normal. Sometimes we had highs in the 80s in southern Kansas this week. So it unfortunately has really pushed things along. When we look at where we typically should be, we're seeing weather conditions right now conducive for mid-April.
With that, is there some concern for freezing?
We've been preaching on this for the last couple of weeks. I'm going to keep doing it. Green up is occurring extremely fast. Things are growing very aggressively, especially with areas that got rainfall in the last week. They're greening up just impressively fast, like mid-April. And that grass is good because it's going to reduce our fire season, but it's bad at the same time because when we look at wheat progressing and fruit trees and really all the vegetation for the most part that's started to green up is at risk of freezing again. We've had a couple of cold fronts this week. Our average temperatures are still right around that freezing mark, so we can still get freezes, and we expect freezes, honestly, through April. And as warm as we've been, we just opened the door for vulnerability to freezes. And with a strong cold front this weekend, it looks like into Monday morning could have the window of maybe a hard freeze north of I-70.
What are you seeing looking forward?
We will have that brief colder period on Monday again, and then temperatures just warm right back up. We'll be in the 60s to near 70 for most of next week, and that's about 8, 10, 15 degrees above normal, depending on where you're at. It looks like we'll be drier than normal. We won't see much moisture across state till probably the end of next week. We look at the next system coming in, and that might actually bring a shot of colder air for that last week of March. It'll be a narrow window of colder conditions. But overall, I think March is going to end up on a warm note and probably keep an active pattern into early April that will hopefully keep us coming with timely moisture, and maybe we can spread some of that to the southwest.
As we do dry out maybe a little bit next week, people potentially out burning their pasture?
We mentioned green ups progressing. That's limiting the wildfire season, thankfully, in a good way. But that's also going to pose some problems, I think, for folks in the Flint Hills. And fire is going to be hard to carry, I think. I know you need fire to help remove some of those invasive species and help get a good stand of grass for the cattle coming in the summertime. But I think we're going to struggle with getting fire to carry. Looking around, those pastures that have been more heavily grazed are not burning well. They're hitting too much green, and the spread is very spotty and patchy, and it's not quite getting the job done. So I think folks are going to struggle to burn. They're going to have a lot more smoke production as well. Something to think about of where your smoke's going to go and what kind of weather conditions you currently have. Because if that smoke stays close to the ground, you could end up putting excess of smoke into folks like Topeka or Kansas City or even Omaha. But we'll see. With a prevalent northwest flow for the coming week until middle of next week, I think most of the smoke will get steered away.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.